A commuter town in New Jersey was going to build a $10 million parking lot, but instead they decided to pay for commuters to take Uber instead. Joining us to talk about this plan is Priya Anand, reporter at Buzzfeed News. Welcome, Priya.
Thanks for having me.
So you write that Summit, New Jersey has a parking problem at their train station. Tell us about this new plan to subsidize Uber rides.
They do, and it pretty much goes the way you would expect any commuter train situation to go, right? You go to the parking lot, you try to find a spot, it takes forever, you circle around, you spend 15, 20 minutes looking for parking. This happens in most highly populated, dense areas. In Summit, New Jersey, a city administrator came in and he said, you know what, I need a more short-term solution than building a parking lot, which would cost multiple millions of dollars depending on how you do it and where you find the land and where you put it at the end of the day. And also it's a pretty long-term solution, right? People will still have to wait for that thing to be built. So he ended up saying, look, let me call Uber, let me talk to Uber's New Jersey office and see if we can work something out where people can maybe take rideshare to get to the train station so they don't have to go park their cars in a lot and have the cars sit all day. They ended up working on a contract program that costed about the same amount as parking would in Summit for a day, about $4 or $2 each way. If you've already paid for parking and you opted to the pilot program, you can take Uber for free. If not, you can pay the equivalent amount of parking that you would pay to park, and Summit will cover the rest of the amount and pay Uber. They'll cut them a check instead. So the drivers will get the same full fare that they would otherwise if it's a $6 ride. Residents, they won't pay any more than they would to park their cars.
So you say that, people that live in big cities are really familiar with Uber. They use it a lot. But, only 15% of Americans have used anything like this, ride hailing, I think ride hailing. Is this the way that they're going to that Uber is trying to get into the suburbs?
Uber has several partnerships sort of similar to this one. This one's slightly different in nature because it's replacing parking, and that's the goal. Usually their partnerships with local agencies are intended to increase ridership of public transportation, right? So when Los Angeles opened up this new Expo line, it's a new line in their train station that goes down to, I believe, Santa Monica. When they opened that up, Uber had a partnership where they did, certain promotional fares to help increase ridership of that. And that's how a lot of their partnerships work. Usually the agency that's subsidizing wants to make it such that people are more encouraged to take that local rail station. Now this one instead is to alleviate parking congestion. This does show how Uber can create a bigger market in the suburbs for itself, right? Because when you're in a less dense area, once you get out of the New Jerseys and New Yorks, maybe the San Franciscos, you get into places where people do have cars that they use on a day-to-day basis, and you get outside of those markets where Uber and Lyft have totally just saturated the game. So once you get into those other markets, there needs to be some sort of incentive, right? If people are sitting there and they have cars in their driveway anyway, and it's like, do I take my car that has all my stuff in it already to go do whatever thing I have to do, to go to the train station or whatever it may be, or go get groceries, or do I use Uber or Lyft? Adding promotions does incentivize that, right? If people know that it's not that expensive to use an alternative, they might be willing to consider it at some point. In this case, they're trying to, with the town of Summit, the city of Summit in New Jersey, they're trying to incentivize it even further. So it's not just, making it cheaper. It's, okay, this is the same amount as parking and your car is just going to sit in a lot otherwise. So if someone else in your family wants to use your car, well, now they can potentially. If you're in Summit, it's a pretty suburban area. So if you have kids, maybe your kid in high school can use your car and drive it instead of you if your car isn't sitting at the train station anymore.
It sounded sort of insane when I first read it, thinking that a parking garage, which is a one-time expenditure for a municipality, seems like a logical choice, and that you couldn't possibly afford to subsidize Uber services for your entire community. But then some of the math that you put out there was really compelling. I mean, it was less than $200,000 a year that this would end up costing the town. You amortize that compared to the $10 million parking structure, and they could do this for 50 years. Transportation is going to change in that time, so this might be a more flexible solution. Do you think that from the nuts and bolts, dollars and cents perspective, this is replicable in other areas?
I don't know if I can really hypothesize how other areas will feel because it depends on how big your town is too, right? And the reason why the rides can be so cheap in Summit. The reason why the city can afford to say we're going to subsidize this and have it still be something that makes sense at the end of the day is because they probably aren't going to be spending so much money cutting Uber the rest of the checks that they are cutting them to make up for the fact that they're subsidizing for their residents, because Summit's 6 square miles. Not every place is 6 square miles and can do something like this, right? So that's a factor. What's also a factor is they're starting off with a 6-month pilot program for about 100 people. They're capping it at 100. Then they'll evaluate and see if they want to continue this. And yes, this is many years worth of savings at the end of the day, right? If you map out less than $200,000 versus the multiple millions it'll cost you to build a parking structure, because what they told me is, look, if we were to build a parking structure, we wouldn't build it for just 100 or so spots near the train station, right? That's crazy. We'd build a bigger one that would probably be more in the ballpark of $10 million. If they were to build a smaller structure, sure, it would be $3 to $4 million. They were like, look, like, if you're going to build something at the end of the day, you account for the fact that your need could increase later and you build a bigger space that would probably cost about $10 million. Then when you factor that out, it is cheaper to subsidize Uber right now. That said, devil's advocate, some city planners or transportation planners might say, yes, but at the end of the day, making some kind of big capital expenditure is an investment that you make one time and then you're one and done. In Summit's case, though, like you said, if you compare 200,000 to 10 million potentially, it's not just a completely short-term solution, right? They're not saving money for just the first 2, 3, 4 years. They're saving money for quite a little bit of time here. So that was the case that they put on the table. And they said, look, like, this is much cheaper for us. If we can make this work, let's see how it works out. Technology is changing so much these days. People are talking about all new kinds of transportation with potentially more and more automated vehicles. So for Summit, they found this to be a compelling solution for them.
I mean, is there an associated risk by doing this? I mean, it's a pilot program. Mm-hmm. So, obviously their alternative was, let's create this solution that's going to last for however long into the future. Instead, they're kind of putting their faith into Uber to try this pilot program. What happens if it goes away?
Well, I mean, they have a 6-month contract in this situation, right? Mm-hmm. In this situation, they do have a 6-month contract. I wrote last month about people in Los Angeles who have been ditching their cars, giving up leases, selling their cars in order to just ride hail, Uber and Lyft all the time. They're taking Uber Pool, they're taking Lyft Line. Talked to a pretty substantive number of people who said they're doing this, and it's a growing phenomenon there. In that scenario, there is a little bit more risk, right? Mm-hmm. Because both companies have price wars with each other in most major cities, at least for certain periods of time, right? New York City, I remember at the start of this summer, for about 3 or 4 weeks straight, Uber and Lyft were just completely in price wars with each other, giving promotion after promotion until, one stopped and then the other finally stopped too. Now, in a case where you have a 6-month contract with the city already, and there is this guarantee that fares will be $2 each way for the commuters or $4 in total, same thing as parking there, then there's slightly less risk. That said, there are a whole host of other issues that come along with privatizing a service like this, right? Everyone brings up the labor issue the moment you start talking about Uber, right? Buzzfeed News reported a few months back, a colleague of mine, Caroline O'Donovan, got leaked documents and wrote a very in-depth story about how in some cases the amount of money Uber drivers make is equivalent to what people make working at Walmart or is less than that. And that brings up a whole host of issues, right? When you're hiring drivers on the government level, those are usually, solid jobs that people consider reliable. And when you take that away and you put things in the hands of a private company, you do leave things open to, a private company and whatever the private company decides to do. Uber says their employees, they classify them as independent contractors, so they don't get the same benefits as full-time workers. But that said, this is a contract program where for the residents, at least, this is pretty much locked in for the next 6 months.
Well, it seems to me that, Uber's long-term goal is probably autonomous cars. So, I think it sounds to me like this is a real way to get autonomous vehicles into the suburbs. To really, because when we think about autonomous cars, we think the city of the future. We think, New York, San Francisco, there's all these robot cars driving around. But what about us in the suburbs? We're still probably going to need to get to places like the train station. But do you think that, was it during your research, do you think that that is really their goal here?
Well, right now they only have their pilot program with autonomous vehicles in Pittsburgh. Uber's put a couple of Ford Fusions on the road there. They plan to have 100 cars on the road there in Pittsburgh that are autonomous, if you could call them that, by the end of the year. Now, that autonomous pilot even comes with a big caveat, right? For now, at least, these cars are not fully autonomous. There's always a test driver behind the wheel, and then there's also an engineer next to that person. So there's not just a pilot, but there's a co-pilot in case something goes wrong. Vehicles won't be fully autonomous for quite some time, right? Most people are estimating that in 5 years, there will be a lot more pilot programs. More common people will be able to test them out and see what it's like and start to get acclimated. That said, we're a long ways away from fully autonomous vehicles. They're just now starting to hit the ground in terms of testing. So by the time they're actually fully out there and, we're in like the Jetsons world where it's not flying cars, but it's autonomous vehicles, that time period is still many, many years away, potentially multiple decades away. And so, yes, while this kind of case study in Summit, where there's a commuter pilot program to take Uber instead of taking your own car to the train station and then hopping on the train, that certainly does make you imagine that there could be a model for autonomous vehicles to do this in the future, right? In fact, that's probably one of the ideal scenarios people would give you, that an autonomous vehicle will take you to the train station or any other sort of public transportation, so then you can get on there and then take your, light rail to wherever you have to go. It presents a case study for that to be feasible in the future in the suburbs, but we're nowhere near the reality for that even happening. It's not like I would even be willing to say, Mom, don't buy a new car. You might be able to take an autonomous Uber in a couple of years. We're very far from that being reality. This isn't a factor really in most people's car buying situation these days.
You're crushing my dreams, sadly.
Sorry. Gotta be in with reality, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing reading your story was notable to me is how technology is really catching up to the way society is changing. When I think of these commuter towns, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, people weren't parking in those parking lots. Their wives were driving them to the train station and picking them up in the afternoon because that's all they had to do, while they were like drinking gin on the couch for the rest of the day. But really, we're not doing that anymore as women. Where, and many times, many women, they were never doing that. But really, we live in a society where people are going to work and they're not driving. And now it seems like Uber is picking up the slack there. Like they'll drive you, they'll be the wife at home. What do you think of that?
I do think when you look at a population like Summit, it's a relatively affluent place. It's a bedroom community in New York. When you get to bedroom communities of major cities, you do get to homes that have multi-car garages, right? Where people are taking husbands and wives, each have their own car. Sometimes the kid has a car. You're taking your car to work. There are multi-car garages and bigger homes for this purpose, right? That's the lifestyle really once you get out of major cities. And this could portend some sort of lifestyle shift at some point if it proves to be a long-term thing beyond just this 6-month pilot program. And more and more towns adopt similar partnerships or initiate similar partnerships, it could show that there could be some sort of lifestyle shift, right? You can very easily envision okay, I'm not taking my car to the train station anymore where it's just going to sit. I'll pay $2 each way to take Uber. That way my kid who's 16 in Jersey and has a learner's permit or is turning 17, whatever, senior year of high school, wants to drive to school. That way my kid can get practice driving to school every day and drive themselves home from soccer or debate or whatever it may be that they're doing after school. So this does show how lifestyles can easily shift as a result of a pilot program like this.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Priya Anand. She is the transportation reporter at Buzzfeed and is Priya's Ideas on Twitter. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.